Good morning. So I just came back from my interview, for the internship position, and I have basically decided that if I get the position, I will be kind of like because I've been just taking my gloves off and throw my hair there instead of just throwing them on the floor or anything. But basically, I kind of like I've been on the fence about whether I should, whether I should get a position because if I do, I'll be making less money, about 600 reais less, and I'm kind of like looking at my finances, and I'm like, can I kind of like accept this? So yeah, so basically I've been unsure. So I decided that if I get the position, it's because it's meant to be, in a certain way. Not that I believe that there's like any greater power kind of like controlling things, but I don't know. I think it's going to be kind of like a sign that this is the position. Also, because it is 20 people that have passed, from like the last stage, and there's 4 positions, and but they did say that like this particular it is worth like this test that we did is worth for like a year. So if in this period of time they need somebody, they kind of like pull from like that list. So if I don't get the position, which I think that I might not get, because basically like it is for me to work with archives which involve old documents, and they kind of like asked me if I had any allergies, and I kind of like forgot for a second that that could be kind of like something negative in like in terms of me getting the position. I just said yes, that I'm allergic to dust and similar things. So I feel like that is going to that particular. But I told the truth. Like ultimately, this is kind of like where I am at. In general, I'm like, what, like what's right is right. And that is kind of like the truth. So it's okay that I said it. Maybe I'm just trying to solace myself, on this regarding like this fact. But this is kind of like where I'm at. So I don't think I'm gonna get this position. So I'm going to continue as I am, but they might call me at some point in the middle of the year. So there's that for me to look after that. And it's also like this is the first time I'm applying to. I mean, I've applied to some situations, some jobs as well, like in this area, in this new area that I started studying. So this is the first process that I've been kind of like accepted to the next stage. So it's good practice, because you kind of like end up learning like what do you want to do, because sometimes they ask me like what exactly are my what do I expect from this internship and what I would expect from this internship, and I said that like I have no experience in this area, but I'm studying this and I want to work with this in the future. So I kind of like wanted, because I've been taught a lot of things in theory, I wanted kind of like a hands-on experience, which I think is kind of like a good answer. Ultimately I was very truthful, and that's kind of like the right thing to do, because yesterday I've been kind of like going through. I'm not gonna say exactly what I did because I'm embarrassed, and ashamed. But I did something that is wrong, and of course, like once you when I get into this position, it is interesting for me to see what exactly do I think is right or wrong, because a lot of people's sense of morality comes from like their religion, and I don't have a religion. So what exactly like what classifies something as being wrong, and I what I found is that a lot of like my principles, they kind of like align with like what I was taught when I was growing up. And naturally there's a lot of things that I was also taught that like I reject, because I don't really see, either I don't see the point, or I think that their reading of the situation is wrong. So it is kind of like there's this kind of like duality here. But there are certain things that I'm like, what, because also like I think that when you're going to decide whether something is right or wrong, you have to kind of like accept you have to kind of like think about the consequences, because there are some things that like I would argue that they are wrong, morally speaking, but like they don't really harm anyone. So I think that in a situation like that, it is I'm more like prone to think that it's okay, even if you could argue it's wrong. I'm trying to think of an example for that actually, and like nothing's coming to mind. But also like we exist under a system, under many systems. Like I think they're all kind of like, there's like this Venn diagram. There's actually like multiple circles, and we are it's depending where we are in the world. Like you're going to kind of like be confined to certain elements, but yeah, so I think that if something is not really harming anybody, like it's easier for you to just be like, that's kind of okay. For example, you could argue like lying, lying is wrong, but that's the thing, like I think that growing up I had this notion that lying was wrong, but like now as an adult I look at it and I'm like, there are some situations where I think lying is justified, and I know a lot of people would disagree with me, but sometimes like it's just like it's not it's sometimes it's just like practical. For example, somebody asks you how you're doing and you're not doing fine, like they don't care, they don't want to hear the whole thing. So just saying like I'm fine, it's a lie, but it's still I know they're not really harming anybody. I don't know, unless it's like your therapist and you're like then you're harming yourself, so that's not ideal. But basically in terms of like of harm, I don't know, for example, somebody they cook something for you, they bake something for you, and it's not the best, but it's also kind of like not the worst. So you kind of like you say that you enjoy it, and it's not really a lie because you did enjoy it. It's just that you could have enjoyed it more. So I think that's the whole thing of exaggerating. So like if something is kind of okay, you don't have to go above and beyond to say that like just being like this is the best thing I've ever tried and all that. This kind of like ties in with another thing that I wanted to talk about, which is the fact that like I kind of like want to stop exaggerating things, because I think this is leading two ways. It's kind of like it is misleading, but it's also something that I think is getting in the way of me. I don't know, because if it's the thing about the power of the word, I don't believe in any spiritual power that words have, but I did grow up in a context in which that was something that was constantly affirmed, that the words have power. So be careful with what you say, and I do think there's a psychological effect, and there's like a lot of things that I really I don't know, like I feel like by exaggerating what I'm saying, like end up believing in the exaggerated version. And it's interesting because like there are some areas of my life that historically I've had certain expectations, but for example when it comes to like many capsules that I have, I feel like sometimes I have exaggerated some of not what I was feeling, what I was doing, but I don't know, for example sometimes like the numbers they kind of like there's been situations where they go higher than they actually happened. And I think this comes from the fact that I kind of like felt like I wasn't really for the longest time I felt like I was kind of like not faking it, because like I wasn't, but I kind of like had this fear of like what if like this is not enough, what if like these actions, because sometimes like there's been things that I've done that are risky. When I think about what could have happened, when I hear other reports from like people who are also experiencing this, sometimes it feels like very lackluster. And the thing is, like right now, I'm no longer in that mindset. I've come to accept that like this is me, and this is how some things manifest. And it's also like I have to think about my circumstances. For example, I have my parents who kind of like help hold myself back whenever something's happening. Also, I've been doing pretty well in terms of like spotting when I see a rise, see a difference, and that makes a huge difference, because that way like I don't have to get to the extremes for me to kind of like for us to try and fix it. When I'm seeing that I'm like rising, I contact my doctor and then she adjusts my medication, and I never really reach like those heights. Like it's interesting because like the lows, like even the lows, like they're much more contained right now. I think that I'm at a point where, the same way with like my manic episodes, my depressive episodes, I can kind of like see things, where they start to happen, and then we change the medication. But I will say that sometimes it feels like it takes like I can go from like 0 to 100, or right 100 to 0, when it comes to like me being depressed. And at the time, like I very quickly, choices are made, and I kind of like do something that can be kind of like harmful, to my well-being or to my life. So there is that. But the point is that I kind of like wanna, so not just with like manic episodes and symptoms and all that, but with just things that I say about myself, even if they're just to myself, because that is kind of like something that was on my mind, because I was like, I'm not saying this to anyone, I'm not telling anybody this, so it is a lie that I'm telling myself. But I'm not, but because there's no impact, like it just doesn't really have a consequence. But what I've been observing is that by kind of like reinforcing those ideas, I am kind of like one way or another, like I am enforcing, like I'm kind of like changing the way I see things. And this change, it goes from like just being like the regular way that things happen to delusional. And it's interesting because I have all these fantasies. I haven't really been having them so much lately, but whenever they do happen, it is one of those things that I yeah, the sense is like they you know, like I think about like very specific scenarios in which I'll be asked about these things, and then that's like this conflict in my head because I feel embarrassed about, you know, like the usually like the lack of things that, you know, happen. I'm thinking about one specific context in which I'm kind of how to put it, I feel like I wanted, you know, more. I wanted to have like a higher number, you know, a higher amount of things, and I don't. So but like I don't have to kind of like, but it's not something that, as I said, like I talk about on a regular basis. So I can kind of like just pretend that, you know, like it is whatever the number I want it to be, and but you know, like, but then I think about these scenarios in which like I would have to kind of like talk about it, and then there's this thing of like this is the truth, but this is what I wish had happened. So. I don't know, like it would be a lie, and I am at this point where, so I don't know, because that's the thing, like some of like these things that I would say like there's no impact, doesn't really change anything, but like these are kind of like affirm. It's kind of like how people have affirmations, you know. These kind of like lies, they kind of like they're my affirmations because they tell me that yeah, like they tell me that I don't know, like they help me kind of like affirm myself. They help me kind of like, you know, be, you know, like be happy, number one, with like where I am at, but also like they kind of like, they're kind of, you know, the whole thing of like show don't tell, so they are kind of like the showing, you know, of kind of like I want to be this, for example, I want to be assertive, I want to be confident, I want to kind of like know myself, I want to know my limitations, you know, I want to be very assured. So I think some of like these lies that I tell myself, they kind of like allow me to believe that that is the case. I want to say lies, like not, they're not complete fabrications. As I said, it's more like an exaggeration of what happened, you know, or like going further, you know, for example, like you go this far, so like, you know, the lies that like I went a little farther away. So, you know, once again, like it is not really the type of lie that would harm anybody. So a part of me is like, okay, it's wrong, but also, you know, like who cares, because it's one of those things that I feel like I would care a lot, but like nobody else would, because as I said, like these are for me, they are kind of like me affirming myself, like me kind of like affirming that I am, you know, competent, that I'm capable, you know, that I've got it, you know, and by it I mean a lot of like different things. So there is, for example, I don't know, like I wanted to be more charismatic, you know, popular, kind of like I want you to be kind of like this force to be reckoned with. It's kind of like to have this kind of like gravitational pull, you know, towards me, and nothing, you know, crazy. So yeah, so like these exaggerations that I have, that I don't, cause that I because most of the time like I don't tell anybody this, so it's just helping me. But as I said, like you say that, you start to believe it, and I already have issues with, you know, like sometimes you know, like my head has fabricated things. You know, I've had as I said, I'm bipolar, so like I've had hallucinations before, complete hallucinations, completely made by my brain, not when I was, you know, under anything, just my brain doing things, you know, when I'm like either too hyper, you know, too manic or I'm too depressed. Sometimes, you know, this happens. So, you know, it's not good for me to kind of like to mix that up. You know, it's not good for me to it's not good for me to kind of like feed these notions, because this kind of like could lead to kind of like me believing that those things, and like I don't want to believe in lies. I don't need lies. You know, like I think I'm at a point where I'm just really happy with where I'm at with life and all that. So like I don't want to live in a lie. I want to live in, you know, the truth. You know, I want to kind of like be able to embrace who I am. You know, my lack of experience, my lack of interest, my lack, my squandering of opportunities, because this is also a thing. Sometimes I look at the, you know, my numbers, as I said, and I'm like, I this number could be higher if I had taken some of like those opportunities, but I didn't, which means that I have to kind of like respect my choice. You know, I have to respect myself, and it's also kind of like telling, because like why did I say no to those situations? And you know, like as I said, sometimes there's a lack of interest, and that is kind of like the thing that, you know, like it upsets me one way or another. But you know, so yeah, so basically kind of like I think that I should find solace in the context, in knowing that this, for example, this number could have been higher, that I could have, like done more. I could engage more because there were opportunities, not as many as I definitely wanted it to be, or sometimes how I, fool myself into thinking that there were. Because some of my fantasies, I understand like they come from a place of me kind of like really wanting something, and sometimes they are just like these conduits for me to kind of like feel like I'm displaying certain traits, certain characteristics, and I don't know. But yeah, so that's kind of like what I mean. Like I want to exaggerate less, particularly like when it comes to me with myself, because if you say this to somebody else, you can be called on your bullshit, and that is not pleasant. But it is something that keeps you straight. But also like I had to consider that the things that I have already said and done in the past, because sometimes some of these things they warrant like a certain type of rectification. Like I kind of like I don't know, because it's kind of like a tricky situation, because as I said, I don't know, like there are some areas that I'm ready to accept reality, and then there's some that I'm not. So it's kind of crazy because I have like this notion that like I want to yeah, like I have this notion that I want to be more truthful with myself, but at the same time there's some areas where I'm still working on that, so it's kind of like farther away than I would like. So on one hand I'm like, okay, I have to be truthful about this because I'm able to be truthful about this area now, but then on the other hand there are some other areas. So right now, like here it is really relative, like the truth and what it means, and here it is pure, and it's just like, yeah, this is what happened. Because the thing I was talking about is that I had my diagnosis of being bipolar back in November of 2019, which means that November this year, it would have been 7 years. So right now, like I can kind of like look, I understand things more. So I look back and I'm like, okay, this is a symptom, this is a symptom, like this is kind of like how we roll. This is how what will make sense. But for the longest time, I was very caught up on like I felt like a fraud, as I said. I should talk more about imposter syndrome because this is something that like it is very paradoxical. There's a dichotomy here because on one hand I am excessively confident. I'm borderline or arrogant. Sometimes I'm fully arrogant about like myself and like my abilities, what I can do, what I can't do, and then there are moments where I feel like I'm lying and I feel like that way. So which can be kind of like, which is something that can be said because it's also interesting because, for example, when I have like a really bad depressive episode, it's awful, but it kind of like validates the notion that I have it, validates this diagnosis, because this is where I met me and all that. But at the same time, it is bad because like there are all these risks. So I'm just trying to find positives, I guess, finding like the glass half full type of way in this situation like that. But yeah, but basically what I'm trying to say is that sometimes I feel I'm like on the top of the world, and I look at my life and I can be confident that like this is the diagnosis that I have, and that I'm not fooling myself or anyone. Like I'm kind of like this is the truth. But sometimes like it feels like I mean, and not so much anymore. I think that's pretty much what I meant when I said like it's been 6 years and a half, right? It's going to be on 21st of May is like me halfway through like the year for me in terms of my birthday. So it was on the 20 something. No, that wasn't the 20th of November. I think I started taking medication was November 28th. But anyway, like let me just get back to what I was saying. I just had a memory, like from the situation, certain event that I participated in, like around the time I started taking medication, and how like those people, they had certain ideas, certain notions, and politically speaking, and it didn't really bother me. I think I was really hyper. I kind of like was going through a bit of a manic episode during like the competition, so there's that. But what I'm trying to say is that now that it's been like many years and I'm already kind of like, yeah, this is my diagnosis, I don't feel like I'm faking it or I'm fraud anymore. uh, but it is interesting that it did happen, and it's kind of like life has basically taught me that like it is legit, that it is real, because like I've had episodes since then. I have manic episodes, I have depressive episodes, and also like I've been able to start to understand how certain things worked in my brain, so I can look back and be like, okay, this was this was an episode, like this is like this is kind of like worth I don't know. I think that I've been able to validate myself, and this is true for like a lot of different areas, but like not enough. Like there's a lot of like areas of my life that I still want to, yeah, like I still um, want to, hold up, a lot of areas where I can still improve. But I will say like the whole imposter syndrome, it's kind of like it doesn't affect me so much anymore, which I think is something that kind of like changes as you get older, because you kind of like you can prove yourself more. You can kind of challenge yourself in ways to kind of like no longer feel like that. And also I think I've embraced some areas where I might be kind of like a fraud. I've kind of embraced it, because sometimes because I think like that is such a strong word, like you're fraud. It's not that, it's just that sometimes I don't have all the skills, like I don't have the skill sets for me to do something, and that's okay. Like you don't have to know everything, you don't have to like be on the top of your game all the time. So I kind of like I've come to accept that. So I feel like the feelings of being a fraud, like they really diminished. They're much lesser than they used to be, and I'm kind of how to put it, um, I don't know. I think there's less of a weight dragging me down, because right now I can just look at them and I can admit to myself that when I don't know something, and that's okay. It's okay not to know. It's okay to I don't know. It's okay to kind of like have doubts. It's okay for you to make mistakes, basically. And just because you're making a mistake, it doesn't mean that you're a fraud. Basically, it just means that you are kind of like doing things your way, kind of. Not necessarily your way. Like sometimes you just follow instructions. And it takes time for you to develop a skill. This is something that I think that life has, like just getting older, it has taught me, because I think when I was younger, I did this thing a lot where if I wasn't good at something like right away, I kind of like gave up on it. I just moved on to the next thing, and that's not ideal. You shouldn't, like do that. You should kind of like persist. You should persevere, and that's kind of like I think perseverance, resilience. These are concepts that have lately been kind of like making an impact in my life. Like I've been, kind of like talking about how I'm more resilient than I used to be, which is in itself a victory of sorts. So in terms of like my episodes, as I said before, like I can perceive them as they come. So can kind of like change my medication and prevent anything from happening. But usually it takes like a little while for the medication to start working. I mean, if you're already taking it, it doesn't take as long, but it does take sometimes a few days. And I've been able to kind of like really withstand it, particularly like me and depression. I've been able to kind of get to a point where I've been able to get to a point where like I can try to kind of like take one day at a time. So I kind of like focus, so okay, so I'm depressed and this is that, but I'm not going to do anything. Naturally I have also like the help of my parents, for example, but I'm not going to do anything against me. I'm not going to kind of like give up. I'm going to persevere. So I think that I've been showing signs of resilience, particularly also like when I'm in situations that are uncomfortable and they're not ideal. I have been able to, I mean, sometimes like, the key to resilience is removing yourself. So I've been doing a lot of that as well. But like, I think it's more guided because, like when I was doing before is that I was removing myself, but I was still affected. Right now, like I'm kind of like withstanding. I'm trying to make the amount of times that I have to do that as, like the amount of times as little as possible. Little amount of times, a small amount of times. You get it. I'm kind of, tired because, as I said, like I went to this interview and I ended up waking up early. And yesterday, like we had an exam, and I think I did okay. There was two questions, like two questions that, like they required a long ass answer. And basically, like the first one, because I only brought a pen, and if I had a pencil, I would be able to try to like writing. So whenever I started writing, I was already kind of like giving the final answer. So like the second question, I think it was more organized, things were more orderly, and the first one was a bit all over the place. But hopefully, let's just wait and see. It's not that it was all over the place, it's just that it was not particularly structured. So there's that. But anyways, like let's just wait and see what my grade will be. But back to what I was saying, I'm able to kind of like consume things and withstand, more. I can kind of like see people talking, some bullshit. Because the thing is that a lot of times, like what would happen when I was gonna say when I was younger, but I'm talking about like a year ago. So it's not, I'm not that much older. But yeah, so basically I would kind of like hear things and they would affect me because they would get me kind of like, they make me hopeless regarding like the fate of the world. It's just like, okay, so you think this, and I'm feel and let other people think like this as well. Like this is kind of like getting in the way of I know it kind of like just made me hopeless. As I said, I kind of like I lost my faith in humanity, and that just made me want to give up. And like right now, I can kind of like withstand more of like the bullshit being said, and I can kind of like just guess one ear like lives in the other, which lives from the other, and I I think that basically I've been able to kind of like let things go, because that's kind of like the issue that I had before, that things were said and they would linger in my brain, and they will every new second make me like more hopeless. So right now that is not so much the case. Right now, like I'm seeing a lot of these things happening, and then like I can kind of ignore some of these things, because which is important, because there's always going to be talks of like bad takes and bad opinions and nonsensical desires that people have, and I can change that, and I shouldn't kind of like feel like it's my responsibility to change, which is it kind of like and gets into like an interesting territory, because I feel like I took a lot of things under my wing. I was kind of like taking a lot of like responsibilities, and that they're not they shouldn't be mine. Like they shouldn't be like where I am at. They shouldn't represent. It's kind of like it's not pretty much that, like it's not my responsibility. And I kind of like am at a point where I'm like, what, like let me acknowledge that I'm like feeling this way, but like without the weight of having to do something about it. I think like that's the biggest thing for me. I felt like the responsibility to do something, and sometimes this something got me like deeper into like that mess. And as I said, like knowing kind of like when to remove yourself, it is important, and it's part of resilience, because I think that also like my idea of resilience when I was younger was very much based on withstanding, kind of like just finding like the worst places possible for you to be in, and yeah, like find work possible, and just like be there and receive those takes, kind of like receive that information, and kind of like like that is what in my head made me strong. And right now I think that removing yourself, it kind of like takes a certain amount of strength, because as I said, sometimes I'm compelled to say something, to do something, and right when I kind of like put it away, I'm having to fight with my ego as well, my arrogance, because I'm like not doing something, and I think there's this misguided sense of responsibility that ends up making a difference. Kind of like when I'm able to confront it, it makes a difference in my life. I'm able to actually start removing myself from the equation, and like that removal, it makes things easier for me. It makes them kind of like more yeah, like it makes my life kind of like easier, because as I said, like I don't you can't remove yourself completely from things, so you have to kind of like make choices in a certain way, kind of like regarding like where you're going, like where you're going to be taken around, and also like this whole thing, like it really it kind of like really attacks my sense of not independence, but my sense of strength, because I feel like I'm being weak when I don't say something. So I'm kind of like working on that, because I have like this feeling, and I don't really know what exactly I can do about it. And so like it is a strenuous process, because I have to fight my ego, as I said. I have to, honestly, I'm kind of like all over the place. I'm struggling to reason right now, which why I think this video is probably all over the place. Uh, I don't know, I feel like I'm getting easily distracted, which could be something, could be nothing. But back to what I was saying, kind of like being silent is something that I've always associated with weakness. So right now, I'm kind of like having to combat, like those lingering feelings that, like I'm weak because I'm not saying anything. And I'm having to kind of like, make peace with that, and but also finding that, like, because what is more important, my peace of mind, or kind of like having less word. And for so long, like, this was like the right answer for me. I felt like I felt like I had to say something, not so much, sometimes not even, I was saying something that was kind of like educating people, but like that was not, the gist of it actually. Like, I think that, I talked about before how when I was younger, I really liked confrontation. I loved the opportunity to confront somebody, and I kind of like, I was almost hoping that those situations would arise, like that I would have, the opportunity to kind of like, tackle some topic or whatever. And I think that, so I would talk about like the sense of responsibility that I felt for being the person to educate, but I think that ultimately it was about kind of like being right, because something was said or done that would kind of like hurt me, it would affect me. So I would want to kind of like hurt and affect, like the other party as well, which is why sometimes, like the language I would use would be kind of like inflammatory, like I was being kind of mean in some cases, like more, mean than I had to be. And I was, because as I said, I think it was not so much about the thing being said, it was about, like kind of like, the person saying it. So that was, something that kind of, that, it's something for me to kind of like consider. Once again, ego. It's not so much about, whatever situation is happening. It's about how I kind of, process it. And I don't know, like, I don't want to process things the way I used to anymore. Like, I don't want to see everything as an attack. Although I could argue that a lot of these things, they are attacks, but I don't want to say anything. I don't want to discuss that. And as I said, like, things will arise, situations will come up, but I don't want to kind of like invite them. I don't want to have to deal with these things more than necessary. I want to, I want every day to be a day where I get in the day and I'm like, okay, I was able to maintain my peace of mind. I was able to stay focused on what really matters, and I was able to kind of like use my time wisely. I was able to kind of like, be productive, not in an overtly sense. Like, I don't want to kind of like live in terms of like productivity, particularly like in this capitalistic context. I want to kind of like do things that, I feel like they're adding, they're kind of like aggregating to my life. And there's just so much to do. There's so much that, we can do. There's so much that we can achieve if we kind of like, instead of focusing on the negatives, we focus on the positives. I sometimes, like, it feels very insurmountable. For example, I'm thinking about my novel specifically because it feels like there's no end in sight, but I can do it. I'm capable, I'm confident, I can finish it. It's going to take some time, but I'm going to get there. The whole trust the process thing, which is interesting because, like, I agree with the sentiment, but I don't know, I think that I didn't find many situations in my life where I would trust the process, because also, like, I think I'm tired, so I'm more prone to feel like, things are not working out. Because, for example, I'm excited with college, but I'm in the first semester. Like, in the middle of the first semester. So there is, apart from this, like 7 more semesters to go. And there's also kind of like work, like am I going to do this for the rest of my life, like how exactly am I going to kind of like go about this. And I don't really have a concrete answer, but as I said, like everything feels that is too much and that it is too far away. And so, but still I prefer this type of, over being overwhelmed than, the one from you kind of like feeling like you're in this world and that the world is going to shit and that, everything is falling apart, everything is getting worse by the day. And I don't know, I really, I still prefer this. So that's kind of like what I try to think. Not only in this situation, but sometimes there are situations that make you uncomfortable, and I try to think, okay, so because, for example, when in the middle of it, I'm uncomfortable. Let's say for something that somebody said or did, like in front of me, and I'm kind of, I feel like, okay, so I'm uncomfortable with this, but this type of discomfort is still better than the discomfort that I was feeling before about something silly. Or sometimes when, like the silly thing is the thing that I'm really concerned about, is I can be like, okay, I'm glad that I'm bothered by this silly thing and not like this heavy, real life world shit, like so. I think that is, it's very much like, the whole like looking at the glass half full. But I think that has kind of like transformed the way I look at things, the way I do things, because I'm basically, every day I'm kind of like, I kind of like, it makes me almost appreciative of, like what is bothering me. Sometimes like, trying to bring something to your attention, it kind of like, it's like you think things are happening at an alarming rate, and when you think about this other thing, it's kind of like it deflates, so it no longer has that effect that it had on you. And that is sometimes like all that you need is not perfect. I haven't really achieved perfection in anything, and hope maybe like I never will, because there's no such thing as perfection in the realm of human beings. But you can get really close to kind of like doing something excellent, which is kind of like an improvement, because I think then in my perfectionist days, like I wanted perfection, and that just led to me being very frustrated all the time because I couldn't achieve it. So right now I'm kind of like setting for excellence. It is an improvement, because basically I want to excel at things. I want to be competent, and I want to be capable, and I want to kind of like, have some type of mastery over the thing I'm doing. But it doesn't have to be perfect, because as I said, really unattainable to human beings. So yeah, just kind of like, and I think like also what matters more now is like me learning, like me kind of like acquiring knowledge. It's better more that, so it's better for me to kind of like have that than for me to kind of like ace some type of test, because sometimes tests are all about memorizing things, and that's pretty much the part that I don't love anymore, which is interesting, because I think when I was younger I really appreciated that. But I will say that I've always preferred questions that are a little bit more, they ask for your interpretation of things, because like that way you can kind of, I don't know, I feel like I'm more capable, not more capable, but I can kind of like talk about things instead of like just writing down what I memorized. So for example, the test yesterday that I took, it was very much like that, so I was very happy with like that development. Because I've been studying for this test, but I sometimes I felt like I didn't completely, I didn't completely, I don't know if you, sometimes I feel like, okay, so I did all the reading, I did all the assessment, and like the summaries and all that, but if you ask me some things, I would kind of like freeze, not freeze, but like it would be, my brain would go blank. So yeah, it was an interesting thing that happened. Like the fact that I could kind of like do well. So I'm saying that I did well. Let's wait and see. But also, something I was talking to my mom yesterday, because like this past, since 2019 was a year, it was my first year of college, and I did pretty well. I was excited about school, I was excited about where I was going. Then I changed colleges and things started to fall apart. It didn't help that the pandemic started, and then I was having a lot of like online classes, which I learned are not ideal for me, which is kind of crazy, because I don't know, for somebody who kind of like prides, I pride myself in my independence, my autonomy. So it's like, okay, like you should try, during this period of time. and I didn't, And since then, like, college has been kind of like more of an afterthought in my head. And sometimes I would get engaged with some classes, but then the moment things started to kind of like start having to kind of like do assignments and tests and all that, I kind of like phased out. So it's kind of like good that I am at this point. I think it's kind of like a testament to the fact I'm really invested in this. But like right now that I am very I don't know. I'm doing things. I did a test. I'm doing the assignments. Like I'm going to kind of like once I'm done with this, I have to finish. Like the forms for like the like the mystery shopper thing that I did. But after that, I'm going to do one of the assignments. This is a group project. I'm gonna do my part, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to do it today because my mom and I we're living in the afternoon. I have some stuff to do, some errands to run. But basically, I'm at this point where I don't know, man. Like, I think that I'm fully capable of doing the assignment, and I think that I have the tools to do it, and I already started doing research. So I'm kind of gonna do it, and then I'm going to I'm going to post it in our WhatsApp group and see what people think. And I want to do a good job, like that is kind of like the thing. I want to do well, and let's just wait and see how it goes. But another assignment that I'm participating in, another thing to do, and I think that also like the course that I chose is very conductive for me to kind of like work well because you have a lot of like assignments as opposed to kind of like tests because as I said, like I don't know, I think that I used to really enjoy it. I still enjoy taking tests, the process of taking the test, I enjoy that, but usually like it's the results, like how are you doing, that is kind of like where like there's room for improvement, I guess. But yeah, so basically, I think the gist, actually, no, that's not the gist what I wanted to say, but like one of the things I wanted to talk about was about the exaggerations, and how I want to kind of like cut them short. And for so long, I was very much like, I had this notion that, if I'm not saying something to, somebody else, then, it's okay for, like those ideas to float around my head. That is not where I am right now, and I hope that so I like whatever I'm enforcing to myself, like that is not ideal, that's not good. So I want the truth and nothing but the truth. Naturally, like when it comes to, for example, the whole thing of like somebody asks me how I'm doing, even if I'm not, I'm gonna say I'm doing fine, thanks, how about you? And that's because I don't know, I think there are some harmless lies that you can tell, but I don't know, man, like it's one of those things that it's kind of like you have to look at it in an individual basis. You have to kind of like see how like that is kind of like where that is at that point in time, instead of like just having a blank, like okay, so I can talk about this, I can be honest about this, because also like it's not like dishonest necessarily to say you're okay, because I don't know. But the point is that it's also something that happens a lot. Yesterday I ended up going back to the mall that I did the mystery shopper thing, and because I had to take some more pictures because there were some pictures that I didn't take, some areas. But basically, what ended up happening is that when I was getting close to the mall, this dude started talking to me, and it's one of those things. I was trying to cut the conversation short because my parents told me like not to talk to strangers, and like maybe it's the Christian bringing me, but like I usually take what my parents say into account, like pretty much, so like that's kind of like the case. So I was trying to cut the conversation short, but I ended up finding myself over explaining things. Sometimes not even like over explaining, but like for example, I was going to do that, like the mysterious shopper, thing, and then I had to kind of like explain to this person what it was, So if I just said I'm going to work out, I'm going to whatever, it would have just cut the conversation shorter. So basically that is something that I was like, what, like sometimes when I'm in the middle of that conversation, I kind of like I say too much and I don't. So basically I say too much, and like it's not necessary because like I'm not invested in the conversation, and I don't want this person to know more about me than like they need to. So I don't know why. So, but it's the truth. So I'm saying telling the truth, but like I don't have to tell the truth. I could have just said I was wearing like gym clothes, so like I could have just said that I'm going to the gym or I came back from the gym or something. It would be a lie, yes, but like it would have cut the conversation short. And that's kind of like the case. And this is not the only time. I think that the last, I don't know how many times I was talking to strangers. I kind of like ended up saying something like that, where I just explaining the whole situation, and I just kind of don't, I don't know. So that's another case where I'm like lying is okay. Where you want to cut the conversation short. But as I said, like I do this thing all the time where I kind of like I answer things with the truth. But like the truth kind of like warrants more questions. Because not everybody knows where mystery shopper is. So like we end up talking more than it was necessary. So that is something that I want to keep in mind in the future. Not saying like more than was necessary. And that's one of those cases where I don't think it's morally wrong for me to kind of like not tell the truth, particularly when it's like a stranger. So stranger danger. I know that I'm like a full grown adult, but like you have to be careful and conscious because you never really know. And that is something. That, oh yeah, also I had this dream yesterday where I kind of like I ended up walking somewhere, and it was kind of like this alley. It wasn't an alley as I started walking, but it became an alley, and then there were just four dudes who kind of like circled me, and they kind of like wanted my phone, and I was like no. So they kind of like stabbed me, and then the other one stabbed me in my back, and I kind of like I ended up putting the knife out and just being like in the throat of like this person who was I don't know why I dreamed this, but I did tell my parents, and so my dad was very concerned because I think that because I had one situation in which somebody tried to kind of like mug me. It was back in high school. I was 20. I was not 20, I was 15. And basically this kid, I say kid, but it was like somebody my age at that point. He was on a bike and he was drunk, and he had like a broken bottle, and he kind of like asked for my phone, and I was like, nope. So he kind of like came with a bottle, and it did help that he was drunk, so I basically held the hand. So that was the whole thing. So basically because of that situation, my parents worried that like if I ever get mugged, I will react, which is not what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to react, and I know that. But I feel like whenever I have like my fight or flight instinct, is always fight. So there's that. When it comes to confrontation, as I mentioned, I'm doing better. I'm not as like engaged in starting like a confrontation, verbal confrontation. But like I don't know if this is going to translate into like these situations. But yeah, so that was kind of something concerning, but it did show, I guess, my character. I didn't know one of those situations. I don't think a lot about it, but whenever, like, if I do, it makes me proud of myself. Even though, like, what I did was the opposite of what you should do. But yeah, so, I don't know, like, because I think that as I said, like I want to project strength, but like not aggressive, abrasive strength. When I was younger, that was the notion that I had. So I was aggressive and abrasive. I will say that in high school, I was quite shy, So I think that somebody who knew me only from school would probably not think that I would have like that response to the situation, but it was. I don't know, it was quite something. But yeah, so I want to have like this assertive, confident type of strength, like, and when I say confident, like that's very important because for so long I kind of like fooled myself into thinking that I was a confident person, but I was being either arrogant or I was compensating for what I didn't have and I couldn't see. And it was kind of like one of those situations that I don't know, sometimes I think about the what ifs. For example, when I was, in our, summer break between, between my first and my second year in high school, I ended up traveling with, it's kind of like some people from from the English school that I was attending, with a language school. and were learning English. And some, other kids were there, but also, like a teacher and a director. And we were there for like about a month, and in the US we went there, and we went to several different places. But because I had this trip, like in April of, like that year, which was, 2014, because, we're there from like December to January, I couldn't really go to a trip that my school had, which was less days. So like technically, like that was better, but I really felt left out because I really wanted, to go, and unfortunately I would not be able to go. And I think that throughout the years I've had different, interpretations of that situation, because, for so long I was so kind of like caught up in the religious trauma and the things that were enforced in that trip, which at the time I was 16. I didn't really think too much about it, but like right now looking back, I'm like, oh, there is a lot of like subtext of what we're doing, lots of like the visits, and that was just made me very uncomfortable, like looking back and just being like, oh, I was invested in this, not invested, but I was involved in this situation. And I was like, so I guess like the school trip would have been better because I would be with like more, I guess like open-minded people. It was kind of like one of those situations. And basically, in the end, like because as I said, like I was more days there, so that might have been like more worth it. And I don't have like one situation that was frustrating, that I remember. That has nothing to do with anything, but I wanted to buy my dad a watch because, he collects watches. He's really into watches, and I wanted to buy him one. And I had kind of like I saved some money for that purpose. And then, like the director, she took my money, like towards the end of the trip because, like we're lacking money to kind of like do things. And I'm like, that is really inappropriate. Like she should not have done that. Like that was wrong. And she was a pastor, so it's like, what's up with that? That's not a very good, testimony that you're sending mixed messages. But yeah, but that is something that I was like, that is fucked up. You did not have the right to do that. And in the end, it was sad because, I wanted to give my dad a gift and I was not really able to do that. And yeah, so, it was, so it's kind of the situations that it kind of like it really changed my opinion in terms of like leaving things, the best things for last. Because sometimes, what happens is that somebody snatches it first. So if I had bought the watch beforehand, because I was like looking at models and prices and all that, like there will be no money for like this woman to snatch. And I think that's the same thing with like I think I had one situation once thinking about food, where kind of like we had I was leaving like something for last, and then this person came and kind of like ate that because they were like, oh, you don't want it. I was like, no, I was saving that. So that was also something that really upset me. But basically, I don't know. I think that right now, like I'm. So the whole notion of like why living something for tomorrow that you can do today, and I think this is a lot of something that we do with our duties and responsibilities, and I subscribe to that mentality. So like I try to do the way that it was something that my parents like they kind of like enforced, which is the notion of particularly my mom force like your duty, then fun, so like first you do what you have to do. And I really think that is the best approach, and that's kind of like how I've been living my life since then. So I think that there's also kind of like part of like why I would sometimes leave something for less, but I kind of like you have to look at individual at each situation as it comes. But basically I've been kind of like enjoying things like first in the past couple of years, particularly because I realized that sometimes like like you might not have like this something in the future, so for example, like an example that I can think of, which is going to make me sound like really irresponsible, but for example, like I'm saving money for getting for my tattoos, and so sometimes I will take from my savings. And you can kind of like think of like what do you do if you need that money. But like that is a problem that I'll face when I get there. I'm not going to prevent myself from like living my life and doing the things that I want, just because of like that, just because that is kind of just because of what might happen, because you figure it out. Ultimately that's kind of like also something that my parents also kind of preach, is that there's always a solution for something. You have to figure it out. Like things are going to happen. Sometimes shit happens, and you figure it out, because you're kind of like a resourceful person. And I'm saying you were like, I like to think that I'm resourceful. I like to think that I can think of solutions. And like writing is one of those situations that really reinforces that for me, because basically I have to find solutions. I have to find connections, and I have to connect things. So like whenever I can kind of like do that, I feel really good about myself. But yeah, so I'm gonna wrap this up right now. This video was all over the place, I know, but I kind of like I've been wanting to talk about the whole exaggerating things, because it's something that I'm noticing that is becoming kind of a problem. It's kind of like also interesting, because this is like a problem that I have, but like it's kind of like there are many layers to things. And like this was kind of like a bottom layer, like so the fact that I'm tackling this right now means that I've been able to solve the other layers. So I'm happy about myself. So it's one of those, like looking at the glass half full. So yes, I have this challenge, but because I have this challenge, it means that I've been able to work on things, that I've been able to tackle things beforehand, other things before. So this is like, as far as like all the problems I've had in terms of like my psyche, or like dealing with myself and doing things, like this is kind of like it's not like a no issue, but like it is kind of like lesser. I don't know, it feels like if I'm talking about this as being the main problem, I've already solved a lot of the things regarding my head. So I'm really happy about that. I Yeah, but so so that's kind of like the gist of what I was trying to say. I ended up going several different tangents, but I want to be honest with myself, and this is not a new problem that I've been facing. This is something that has always kind of like been an issue, but right now is the time for me to tackle it. Like right now is the time for me to be more honest with myself. And I think that like I have my little notepad, Moleskin, of which where I kind of like write things. So I think it might be time for me to just write a lot of things down, because I could say this, but like some of these things, I find it to be very embarrassing. It's kind of like, why am I so caught up in this? Like, why do I care so much? And also there's a part of me that's embarrassed about, as I said, the numbers. Like, I'm kind of like embarrassed about like the amount of things. So I'm not going to be saying that today, but I will be writing it down, and I think that I will be all the better off for it, because I think this is the beginning of my journey of this arc that I'm going to start following, where I will like, and it's interesting because like some of like these things, I'm at a point where I'm like, what, maybe it's a good thing that I didn't have like so many experiences of X, Y, and Z. It's kind of like a good thing that I am it doesn't, yeah, it's kind of like a good thing. It makes me, I think that I'm walking towards a more elegant part of my life. I still have like my because I think that for the past decade or so, I've been kind of like more alternative, more casual, like more more a lot of like things. And right now I'm entering a different stage. I'm kind of like changing my wardrobe. I'm kind of like have like a different style, you could say. And basically what that means is that I don't know. I think that like it's also something that is translating into like my behavior. So I don't know. I'm kind of like entering this new stage. I'm getting closer to my 30s, so I think this is also part of that. It's kind of insane that I'm 28. Like I didn't think I would make it past 20. Then I didn't think I would make it past 27, and now here I am. So this is so kind of like unthought of for me, that I'm entering this new stage, and I think these things are connected. I think that I think that you can have the same style for the entirety of your life, or you can kind of like change, and that is kind of like me. I'd say I think that I've had many different types of style as I passed, and I don't think that I don't look back at them and I feel like, oh, that's a mistake or whatever. I just feel like, no, that was where I was at that point in time. And I don't know, I think that I've been able to look back and be like, okay, it's okay that I did this or that I didn't do this at that time. And I think that my disposition is kind of changing in terms of like how I want to be perceived and who I want to be. And I think that I'm I don't know, it's kind of crazy how like how much something can change in 1 year, because I'm thinking about like a year ago, and I was embarrassed about these numbers, and but for like a kind of like a different I know I still am a little bit embarrassed, like about how little I know, how little I did, about how my experience in some areas is not particularly significant. For example, today I was, when this interview for this internship, I was basically, I kind of like was talking, and they asked me for my professional experience, and I did not have that much, to talk about. In terms of because I think that I spend a lot of time like doing things that make money, but like they're not really professional experiences. For example, the stuff that I sell online, like that is, I mean, I guess it is a type of experience, but like it doesn't really translate into like what I want to do, the areas of my life of like like I want kind of, it's going to be kind of like an office job in a certain way, and it's kind of, yeah, like it's going to be an office job, and I only have like so much experience. And this is something that I think that for so long I was like really embarrassed about that. And right now, like not so much. I'm like, what, like that is my life. Shit happened, like so there were things that I had to do. There were things that I had to kind of like give up on doing because of my situation, because of my condition. And right now I'm kind of like I'm getting back on track. So like if I get this internship, it's going to be a really positive experience because I'm going to be able to add that. So, and also like it's going to be in the area, because so far all those internships that I took, like they were in areas that had to do with where I was working, or sometimes not, but I wasn't really invested in that. I wasn't really seeing a future in those areas. So right now, like it's going to be different, and better late than ever. I think that I generally believe that at this point in time, because there are points where I felt like it was too late for me to have something, and it was too late in the sense that like there's nothing I could do. There was also this very defeatist attitude, like no doubt, but it was something, like things are not lost, like things are not over. Like life is going to continue. So just because you haven't, for example, had like enough work experience so far, it doesn't mean that you never really will have it. That you shouldn't give up. What I'm trying to say. So I'm trying to be more honest with myself, and that involves a lot of it has to do with experience. And it's interesting because like right now, I feel like I'm kind of like tied up to lies, and I'm kind of like I spot the lies and I spot, how they're affecting my brain, but like I don't know how to break free. But like it is something that I am. Yeah, it is something that I don't know. But that's the thing. It's not the end. Like it's not the end. I can still, I can still work on this. I will get to a point where I generally do not care, about my lack of experience, in various areas, because, and also like the way that you kind of like tackle that is by having more experiences, like I have to kind of like accept myself as I am, but, in the future, I will have more experiences, as I said, like, work experience, like here's a possibility, and I really want to keep on living, and I want to not be embarrassed about myself and about the lacks, because I'm talking about experience, but there's a lot of things that like they upset me, that because there are things that I don't have, and I'm not talking about material possessions. I'm talking about personality traits, about situations, the way I responded to them at different points in time, and I think that's that. So anyways, bye.